I want to welcome you all to today's webinar on work-life compatibility. So work-life balance is out, work compatibility is in, and our presenter today is Anna Auerbach, class of '05. My name is Alexandra Stevens, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. I also wanted to welcome those of you who will be listening to the recorded version of today's webinar. So now to introduce our speaker, Anna. She's a proud Brandeis alum and the co-founder and co-CEO of Werk, the go-to destination for flexible work options for ambitious women. Werk aims to fix the leadership pipeline where it's most broken, at or before opt-out. By pre-negotiating flexibility for leadership track roles, her company creates greater work-life compatibility, advancing women to the highest ranks of leadership over time. Prior to her work with Werk, Anna was a strategy consultant for over 10 years, most recently as the COO of a philanthropy catalyst firm. But she began her career at McKinsey Co. She has an MBA from Harvard Business School and currently lives in New York City. So welcome, Anna. So excited to have you here for this really important topic.
Thanks so much for having me, and welcome everyone that is live and will be listening to the recording later on. This is just an incredible opportunity. I feel like life is coming full circle, having graduated from Brandeis and now being able to share this story and join all of you. So in terms of today's webinar, I'm going to share a little bit of the background of why flexibility, why we do what we do with my startup. I'll share some advice on negotiating flexibility and introduce you a little bit about sort of our world view. As Alexandra mentioned, there's going to be ample time for questions. It's really important to me that we have a great discussion at the end. So I don't want to lecture at you all for the whole time. So in terms of getting started, my own personal story, Alexandra shared a lot of it, but one of the keys to my story and kind of how I arrived at this is when I graduated from Brandeis and, when I went out into the real world and started at McKinsey Company, I really thought we were living in a post-feminist world. I thought the world was going to be my oyster. There was no question in my mind that I would be able to achieve anything I set out to. And in fact, the fact that I got into McKinsey Company, which didn't recruit on campus, and my entry-level class was 50-50 men and women, it was such a testament to that. But the challenge was I looked up and the senior levels of leadership were only 5% women. And that was honestly where the seed of something is broken in our work structures was planted. And it kind of continued over time. I saw similar patterns when I was at Harvard Business School. And I'm not sure I totally understood it until I had a child myself. My son Asher is going to turn 4 this month. I was just sharing it with Alexandra before. And so, obviously he's a huge inspiration, and what my peers have gone through and women before me have gone through is obviously a huge inspiration. So let me start with a little bit of the facts. Today, only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. The shocking stat I always share is that in the S&P 1500, there are more CEOs named John than there are women altogether. And everybody's like, well, John is just a common name, but there's actually more CEOs named David than there are women CEOs altogether. And this might, you might think it's just sort of a business problem, but in Congress, only 19% of seats are held by women. Only 18% of venture-backed companies have a female founder. In fact, last year, only 2% of venture capital went to female-founded companies. In the 88 years of the Oscars, only 1 woman has ever won Best Director. Only 4 have ever been nominated. Obviously, we've never had a female president. And so this challenge of getting women in leadership is an obvious problem, and yet it's nothing new. We've been talking about this challenge for years and years. And yet actually, if you look at the trajectory of some of these numbers, obviously some have improved, but they haven't improved markedly so. If you go back, the question always that people ask is, well, are women, achieving at different levels? Are women less ambitious? I can say definitively, having looked at every single research article that is out there, there's no ambition gap, there's no aspiration gap. In fact, women earn 57% of all bachelor degrees. In terms of science and engineering degrees, it's actually 50-50, and people are very surprised by that. In terms of graduate degrees, women are 48% of medical degrees, 47% of law degrees. It's actually a little bit lower for MBAs, but it has been improving. So women are achieving at super high rates earlier in their careers, and they end up being about 59% of the college-educated workforce. So the question is always like, well, what gives, right? You start with 59% of women being the college-educated entry-level workforce, but only 5% at the highest levels of leadership. So when my co-founder and I were starting the company, like I said, we looked at every bit of research and we read every article we could find. And here's what we saw. We saw the press talking about the fact that women are less ambitious. We saw the fact that the press was saying that men are better negotiators, that women needed to seek a sponsor, that they couldn't find mentors, that they needed to lean in more, advocate more, negotiate harder, negotiate better. And that's not what we thought was the problem. Looking at ourselves, our peers, the incredible women that had achieved success before us, that really had nothing to do with why women were being held back from roles of leadership. What we found when we looked at the data, and this is where, while we'll talk about flexibility today and that it's about work-life compatibility instead of work-life balance, is 30% of the most talented women leave the workforce entirely after having a child. And an untold number of women opt down into roles that are not leadership track. 70% of the women that leave the workforce say they would have kept working if they had access to flexibility. That is 6.6 million women that we can get back into the workforce and keep in the workforce if we give them access to flexibility. Interesting thing is that when you think about a job search, one Bain study showed that women value flexibility over and above pretty much every single factor, including pay, title, location, job function. So flexibility is their number one factor. So why isn't there a marketplace today where women can find flexible work, and why is it so hard to negotiate for flexible work? So the challenge is that we realize that flexibility is just very much misunderstood. If I asked all of you what flexibility means to you, and it's too hard to do a poll, I'm sure I would get as many answers as we have participants on the webinar. It means something different to everybody else. To me, it might mean not traveling. It might mean flexible office hours. To someone else, it might mean fully work from home. And the reality is, because people are seeking flexibility, but there's no way to frame it, that means there's no way to find it. There's no way to negotiate it for it. There's no way to access it. So we came up with our own definition for flexibility. To us, flexibility, and you have the definition on your screen, it's a set of agreed upon terms between an employee and their employer at the outside of an employment arrangement that is used to modify and enhance traditional work structures in order to create compatibility, that's the key word, between the needs of the employee and the objectives of the employer. Ultimately, to us, flexibility, and until we came along, no one had really defined it, flexibility is about creating compatibility. And that's different than balance. Compatibility means that women and men are positioned to perform at their best, and companies are positioned to access the best possible workforce, retain the best possible workforce. One of the things that we did as our own company is we came up with a set of terms that help define flexibility and break it down into its component parts. One of the challenges with flexibility today, as I mentioned, is that it's really misunderstood. If you look at the research on it, 80% of companies today have some form of flexibility policy. There's going to be a lot of numbers, so bear with me for a second. Those policies are only well documented in about 40% of companies, and the uptake on those policies by the workforce is only about 10 to 12%. In fact, the surveys are pretty terrible on this. So here's what's happening is companies actually want to offer it, people need it, except they just can't find a way to connect. And so they need to have a marketplace. And this is I was an econ major at Brandeis, so this is pure economic theories. You need to create an exchange. And that's one of the things we did. And we offer this framework up to the world for all of you to use to the extent that it is helpful. We have 6 ways that we think flexibility can be packaged. Some of these sound very familiar and obvious. Some of these are a little bit different. So let's start with some of the more obvious ones. Remote, you can work from anywhere. Part-time, meaning an actual reduced work schedule, workload. It could be 50%, it could be 60%, it could be 80%, whatever it is. And let's talk about the 4 middle ones. They're a little bit different. So Desk Plus is actually a structured partial work from home arrangement. We realize, in having talked to 300 employers, that there's a lot of emotional baggage with flexibility. So we really want to reframe this. This is about somebody having an office and a desk, 3 or 4 days a week, and the other days they can be working from everywhere. Travel light, this one is my pet baby, because when I was a consultant at McKinsey, I took 95 flights my first Tuesday. It was nice to have platinum status, but it was not nice to never see anyone ever again. So travel light is a really important factor for a lot of parents, and frankly is a deal breaker in terms of taking jobs. Time shift. This is one that is a little bit more innovative, and some companies are starting to embrace this, but this is still a bit at the forefront. Time shift means standardly unconventional hours. This could mean you work in 2 blocks a day. You work from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. and then the rest in the evening. It could mean you totally shift your hours. Some people would prefer to work noon to 8 p.m., whatever it is. But it is some non-traditional time arrangement, but still a full job. And then the last one I haven't talked about is microagility. This, in some ways, is our biggest innovation and yet the easiest thing for companies to do. All microagility means is the ability to make micro adjustments on an ongoing basis. We actually believe every job should be a microagility job, and the reality is, as you all negotiate for flexibility and or help others with that, this is one of the easiest things to ask for, which is you still have a full job, you still have an office, but you have the ability to make micro adjustments here and there. Nanny's late, child needs a doctor's appointment, you need to take care of something else, and it's not the end of the world. We truly believe that flexibility is the future of feminism. It's a bold statement, but we believe that flexibility is what workplaces would look like if women had been involved in designing them. The reality is that our work structures today are a relic of the post-industrial era, when our workforce looked like one parent that worked, which tended to be the man, and one person that stayed at home. And that does not reflect modern realities. Modern realities mean that in most families, both parents have to work or want to work. Not every family looks like a man and a woman and 2 children. And we believe that work needs to adapt with modern realities. In parallel, there's also a generational shift. There's so many articles about companies struggling to attract millennials. And there is a huge attitudinal shift happening where millennials refuse to sacrifice this idea of life compatibility. Whereas in previous generations, there was a bit of an attitude of, you just have to put your head down and reemerge when you make partner, when you get to that next milestone. I think millennials are leading their careers in a different way. They're looking for meaning, more impact. And we're actually seeing the highest rate of stay-home dads we've ever seen in millennials. It's still very low. It's still only 9% of the stay-at-home parent population, but it is increasing. One of the ultimate goals, and I think Alexandra mentioned this a bit at the beginning, and I mentioned this and while we launched the company, is we want to change the number of women in leadership. We want to ultimately change representation. So we believe flexibility can do that. Crazy chart here in front of you, but if you look at the lowest line, that's the today line. You start with women being 47% of the workforce, but only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs. The orange area is the women we believe we can save from opting out. And these are the 30% of women that opt out, 70% would have stayed working if they had flexibility. Then there's another whole portion, which is women who are often forced into non-leadership track roles after they have a child. Let's say we can save a similar percent. Well, what happens? We get 100 new female CEOs. And so we truly believe that flexibility is the key. There are so many other factors. I don't want to make the idea of women work seem like a very simplistic notion. All the programs around mentorship, sponsorship, professional development are critically important. But our angle is that we believe without fixing the structure, none of those programs can really work. And then for decades, we've been trying all these other programs, and it's time to start addressing some of the root causes. It's not to say that there isn't gender bias, there isn't unconscious bias in the workplace. There absolutely is. And frankly, just to overshare a bit of our own internal strategy, we want this to be a solution for men as well. Today, we certainly don't discriminate. Men are welcome to join our platform. Ultimately, we believe that as people have more access to flexibility, it'll actually help with equality altogether. A couple things about flexibility. So as companies embrace flexibility, they're going to disproportionately help women get to leadership. Companies with meaningful numbers of women in leadership improve by every metric, and gender diverse organizations are 15% more likely to outperform their peers. Women-led companies have better working conditions and fewer layoffs, probably not a surprise. And a recent study by the Rockefeller Foundation actually found that closing the corporate gender gap could boost the US economy by 2.1 trillion. So this is just good business. Before I move on to that, one thing that's important to note about flexibility, as I already mentioned, is that it's not just a women need, and therefore it should not be just a women's solution. Flexibility in general and workers with flexible schedules are better for companies. When workers have flexible schedules, they are happier, more effective, more productive, and less likely to leave. And so it's just good business. And so I'll talk a bit in the next section about advice. So first of all, we'd love to welcome you all onto our platform. If that is helpful to you, please spread the word. But beyond that, for jobs that don't have flexibility built in today, I'd love to share some advice on how to negotiate for flexibility. What we do with our startup every single day is we recruit companies to join our site and we pre-negotiate flexibility for our members. I have experience myself negotiating flexibility in every single job I've had. And so I'd love to share some of what we learned and how you can use that yourself in your own negotiations. The most important thing, and why I share a lot of the stats about the business advantages, is that ultimately the more we can treat flexibility like a strategic business solution, the less it's about feelings and the less it's about balance. And ultimately, companies are set up to achieve higher shareholder value. So the more we can think about framing this as a solution that helps with increasing shareholder value, the better off we will be. All right, so now some tips, and then I would love to turn it over to you all for any questions. Number one, and this is sort of obvious, but figure out what kind of flexibility you need and why. It seems obvious to be self-aware about what is important to you, but it's not always easy. I think because sometimes we start with sort of the current conceptions of what the flexibility options are, it holds us back from thinking about what is actually necessary for us to be more effective as a person. So me personally, I have a almost 4-year-old son. He tells me he's 4 and pretending to be 4 now. But for me, my deal breaker is I pick him up from school on Fridays, and that is critically important to me. The other thing is, and that is sort of from a caregiving standpoint, from a how I work standpoint, which is equally important in terms of flexibility. I know that I cannot work in a 9 or 10 hour stretch. I know I am optimized when I can work until 2 or 3, take a break, shift my location, and then pick work back up. So step one is actually figuring out what makes you more successful in fulfilling the other responsibilities and priorities in your life, but also how you personally work best as a human being. Number 2, do your homework. And what that means is the homework on what is available at the company today. What's incredible is because of the internet, we have so much information in front of us. The reality is for most companies, you can find incredible information on what they offer. Those statistics that I mentioned, that 80% of companies have some form of flexibility, it's only documented in about 40%, and the uptake is low. One of the reasons the uptake is low is people just don't know what's out there. And so part of the burden is on the company to start sharing their flexibility policies. Until today, there hasn't really been a job site or a platform for that. We hope to help with that. But outside of that, there are great user-generated reviews. One great one for maternity leave policies in particular is Fairy Godboss, and the secondary one is List Your Leave. I'm happy to send Alexandra all of these after. If there's a way to send out these links, I'd be happy to provide that. Also looking at Glassdoor, The Vault, there's so many user reviews, and if you even just Google, flexibility, work from home at X company, you will actually find a lot of information. You can also find people that work there and ask them what's available to them. The reality is for a lot of companies, they sometimes don't let flexibility policies open up until you're there for 3 months. So talking to people who've been at a company for a couple of years is a great source of information on what is ultimately possible. Again, we'd love to change all that. We'd love for there to be greater transparency on this information, but you can actually get a pretty good chunk of it on what's online today. Number 3, make a business case. I started with the framing of, for as long as you're working for a for-profit company, it's about shareholder value. Even with a nonprofit, nonprofits are constantly struggling. And I had a chunk of my career that was in nonprofit and philanthropy, but they're constantly struggling with how to recruit and retain the best talent. So to the extent that you can make the business case that flexibility is either good for a company's bottom line or will make you more efficient, more effective, more productive, company's going to get, or nonprofit is going to get more out of you, it is really important to start the framing with the business case for why flexibility is important. Be a slave to your calendar. And what I mean about that is if you set a certain type of flexibility, stick to that flexibility. And if it means if you have, pre-negotiated, for example, I pre-negotiated, well, it's my own company, but I have set in stone that I pick up my son on Fridays. I always do that. If I let that slip one time, it's too easy to let it slip the next week and the week after. Be really ruthless about the flexibility that you have in place. Honor it, respect it. You're also setting a great example for others, and you're also communicating that you are good at managing yourself. Be very careful about sort of calendar bleed into other areas of your life, and also be ruthless about communication. And that leads me to number 5. So prove that it works. The reality is flexibility today is a novel concept. We all know what a full-time job is. Most of us also know what a 1099 contract worker, gig worker is. Flexibility is somewhere in the middle. It tends to be a W-2 with modifications. So it's still a high burden on anybody who has a flexibility program today to talk about it, prove that it works, stick to it, make it successful. And a big part of that is communication upwards, outwards with everyone. The ultimate point I want to leave you with is, there's been a few articles about whether flexibility actually makes women more vulnerable. The reality is we cannot change the fact that there is gender bias today, but gender bias should never be a disincentive for action. The fact that flexibility programs today may be perceived as more necessary for women should not be a reason why we don't use them, should not be a reason why we don't encourage men to use them. We need to keep talking about it, and we need to implement real solutions that address root causes. And this is always our favorite quote and favorite inspiring quote to live things on. Gloria Steinem once said, "Don't think about making women fit the world, think about making the world fit women." And as I said, we truly believe that flexibility is the way work would have been designed if women were part of designing the workplace in the first place. So that is it for me. I am so excited to get to questions. Alexandra, you'll help me moderate, but I'm thrilled to answer any and all questions, be it about flexibility, the startup, personal path, whatever is most helpful. It's your webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna. So couple questions here. One question from one of our listeners: given the emphasis of your work on the construct of flexibility, how do you define the idea of work compatibility beyond obtaining flexibility?
It's a great question. So work compatibility is obviously much more than just flexibility and job structure. There's actually been incredible, and obviously I live and breathe in this field and in all the news, but there's been a lot to talk about work environments as part of compatibility. And by the way, just going down the gender sort of path for a moment, there's actually been a lot of research that shows that women find their work environment and sort of the comfort of their work environment is much more important than men, and are much more affected by uncomfortable work environments, which by the way is fascinating, because one of the things I always talk about how workplaces were designed for men in the first place is the thermostat. Women are constantly freezing in offices. Why are they freezing? It's because the thermostat is set to 65, because men tend to be wearing 3 layers for every woman's 1 or 2. And so compatibility can mean a variety of things. We believe that structure is one of the most important ones. The reality is, if you have a schedule that is not compatible with you, it causes you so much stress. And it actually comes back to psychology, where it is taxing on your brain. The more things you're worried about and you're stressed about, you actually perform less well, because they are burdensome to your performance. And so to us, the primary angle of compatibility that hasn't been addressed is actually the pure structure, and that is the one that is most taxing. Compatibility can be a lot of other things. It could be your physical work environment. It could be what you choose to do, the impact you want to have in the world, or what your goals are, the values that you lead your life with. So I think compatibility is much broader, but the piece that we really want to focus on is the compatible work structure, because without that, frankly, everything else falls apart.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions coming in, really interesting, about part-time work versus full-time work. So first question is, could you talk more about having a part-time job and a full-time career? So you're full-time dedicated to your career, but you're working part-time, and how to go about convincing an employer of that balance, really.
Yes, and this is one of the hardest. So I will admit I am a flunk out of the 80% program. And frankly, one of my inspirations was I had a job that I negotiated down to 80%. I was working 150% and I was getting paid 80%, which I think is unfortunately a lot of people's experience. So I think part of that, and there has been research to show that you're much more effective with a part-time program if you go in with a part-time program. People that start full-time and then go down to 60, 80, whatever it is percent, are actually less successful. It's not to say we should stop doing that, right? Like that shouldn't be a disincentive either. But the reality is it's sometimes easier to start with fresh expectations. And it's for 2 reasons. 1, your employer does not have false expectations of how much you're going to achieve. And number 2, it's actually yourself. I think for us high achievers, going down from 100% to a 60 or 80%, we always feel like we're still trying to prove ourselves. So number 1 advice I have is it's easier if you start fresh in a new job. The second thing I would say is it's actually sometimes easier if you go down in company size. And what I mean by that is, at least what I've seen, so we've been operating our company for about a year. The most successful part-time programs I've seen are people who went from really big companies, big corporate professional services, into a startup or small business. And they took actually a really senior job, like somebody who is a financial analyst, not that senior at JP Morgan, found a job as the director of finance at a startup. They work 3 days a week. It's actually a bigger job than they had before, but in a way, a smaller work schedule, bigger scope, less schedule, which is sort of a crazy trade-off. But I would encourage, as you think about a part-time job, full-time career, I think smaller companies and startups today appreciate that a lot more. And they're also just so excited when they find phenomenal talent that is willing to help them at senior levels. The other thing I would think about is just demonstrating how that job can be done in a reduced scope. And this is something I actually have had success with, which is essentially trying to break up the hours of showing how you can do a full job in a reduced schedule. Be careful about schedule bleed and that sort of trying to work 150% but getting paid whatever is the reduced percent. But I would encourage you to really look at the scope, look at a smaller company in summary, and try to start that fresh, because going down in scope is actually one of the harder things to do. I hope that helps. It's a hard thing, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, this next question is related to that in a lot of ways. So this listener is a corporate HR executive, and she's curious how you address the perception that a full-time employee works far more than 40 hours, to what you were saying, and yet a part-time person works exactly the number of scheduled hours. So overall, there's this perceived productivity issue among peers. And she's asking this especially in light of your comment to be a slave to your calendar, as you mentioned, and keeping those boundaries. So how would you address that, perception?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I would argue, being less on the recruiter side and more on the employee side, and having so many peers that have gone through this, is that all the part-time employees also overwork. I think everybody overworks today. And I would argue that sort of delta, if you will, that increase in your work for part-time people actually ends up being a higher percentage on their base. And we're seeing that with a part-time employee in our own company. We have to constantly encourage them to actually only work their part-time hours. I do think part-time, and what I started with is part-time programs are the hardest. I think reduced scope is one of the hardest things. That's actually why that's only one of our 6 options today. The 5 others are a full scope job, but with sort of modifications on how to fulfill that full-time job, meaning when and where. So in terms of, the specific question around the perception of part-time people not working more, I think the reality is there has to be a broader culture change to address that. The reality is we need to get into a place where our work is actually about results-oriented work. And I think a lot of companies are starting to move in this direction, meaning that whether it be a full-time person or a part-time person, what they should be accountable for is fulfilling the scope of their job, whatever, be it a full scope or a partial scope. And it shouldn't matter if they do that in fewer hours or more hours, as long as that person is happy and they're fulfilling their scope. I think, specifically what I meant by being so conscious about calendar is about setting the example. I think the challenge is, if you are working part-time, pre-negotiated, but then you're working a full schedule, that is really confusing. You're going to be unhappy, and the company is also going to be very confused as to why you reduce your schedule, though they'll probably be happy they're getting more work. It also makes you seem really inefficient, frankly. And so I would come back to that question around focusing on results-oriented work, which is ultimately our goal and where the world should go in terms of work, in our opinion, is this is the scope of your job, do the scope of your job. It doesn't matter how or when you fulfill it. And so for a part-time job, that scope is just reduced. So it shouldn't matter how or when they achieve that scope, as long as they achieve the scope.
I think those are great points, especially in terms of setting the example. Do you have tips for negotiating flexibility without an explicit or implicit expectation that will require accepting less money? So I think, there are always those trade-ins. It's like, oh yeah, well, we are getting that Monday off at home. So, how do you want people to address this?
So I don't think the assumption should be that you're taking any pay hit. As long as the scope is not taking a hit, your pay should not take a hit. Your pay is for the scope of your job, not where you're sitting when you're doing your job. So I truly believe that certainly as you go into a negotiation, do not assume that as you're negotiating for flexibility, there should be a salary trade-off. If there's a scope trade-off, there should be a salary trade-off, right? It's back to sort of framing everything as the results orientation of your work. I will say companies today fall into two camps. There's some where flexibility is absolutely the norm and generally has no hit on people's salaries. And there's other companies where flexibility is seen as sort of a perk and a benefit, where that is seen as sort of complementary to providing value to you, like a health insurance policy. And it's yet another thing that sort of subtracts from your base. It's hard to know today. We are still in the very early stages. I think for some jobs, flexibility does come with a pay hit. I wouldn't make that assumption, though. I also would say it depends a little bit on what your own path is. You know, my advice around the part-time question, around maybe doing like a part-time CFO at a smaller company, is a way where you might actually take a financial hit a little bit, because obviously a small company cannot afford to pay what a large company would, but the reward will be much greater by having actually in some ways more responsibility, but in a compatible way. So it's a hard one to answer, but I would definitely not go into any negotiation assuming you're going to have to use comp as one of your negotiation levers.
Great points. So if looking for a new job, when is the right time to bring up flexibility during the hiring process? Because I think what makes Werk so cool is that it's pre-negotiated. So you take the stress out of the game, right? People search your job site, they find jobs, they already know going in what the flexible elements are. But for those that don't, and for the majority of companies, as you mentioned, that don't advertise what their flexibility options are, when is the right time to bring it up during the hiring process? Should you wait until after you start to negotiate? How can you prove yourself? All these pieces.
I love this question. All these are great questions. So thank you all for being so engaged in the discussion. This is a really hard one. The reality is, and when we talk about our company, one of the things we always talk about is that today, when does this conversation happen about flexibility? Usually after you have a job offer where you're sort of in this position of like, but hey, could I, work from home one day a week, or I'm a commuter, I need to time shift my hours. And it's not coming from a position of strength. And that's because we haven't set up potential employees and people out in the world to succeed in these conversations. So my hope is that as Werk continues to grow, we at least have this information available to you, whether or not you find this a job on our site or not. We'd like to increase the transparency of flexibility policies. Before that happens, I would say it depends a little bit on the culture of the company. And this is not a cop-out, but I think it is an unfortunate reality. With more traditional, more conservative companies, I think it starts with doing your homework. You'll get a lot of understanding in terms of the culture of the company just by doing the homework around what policies do they offer today, what are people's reviews on the flexibility of the company today. There, by the way, I think it's Fortune has like a 50 best places for workplace flexibility. There's another company called Flex Jobs who are sort of a competitor to us, except their jobs are not really leadership track. They're a little bit more entry level. But what they have done exceptionally well is collected a lot of great data on flexibility. And so we use a lot of their data, and we may actually partner with them in the future. But Flex Jobs will rate companies according to their flexibility policies as well. So I would start with homework. If the company seems amenable to flexibility, they're more innovative, they're kind of more forward thinking, I would start it right at the beginning. But I would position it as a business case, which is like, I'm aware of these things. This is what's going to make me a better employee. And I actually think that confidence and that self-awareness is very impressive to companies. If it is a company where flexibility is not the norm and it's a more traditional company, unfortunately, my advice is I think you have to save it until you get the job offer. And that's not a great answer. And I wish it weren't that way, but I think that's going to make you more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on what you're saying, out of the Hyatt Career Center here, what we coach folks on in terms of the negotiation process is that negotiation begins when you have the offer and not before that a lot of times, because it does put you in the driver's seat when a company says, I want you to work for us. And then you do have a little bit more of that leverage to say, okay, well, here is what it will take. And we constantly remind folks that negotiation goes beyond just salary to be vacation time or other flexible options as you're mentioning. And so that can be part of that negotiation step, but you're so right about doing your homework in advance, and informational interviews and networking amongst Brandeis alumni, for example, is a great way to find out some insider information.
I love that idea. I think the reality is the Brandeis network is so big that you'll probably find somebody that's worth there, and I also, just one thing I would add is, I think companies truly, and I've been on the hiring side of things, I've been on the trying to get a job side of things. I think companies just so value mature employees that are self-aware, which sounds like a weird thing to have to say about grown-ups, but it's been remarkable to me how many people I've interviewed, and we're hiring right now, that are not that self-aware. So the self-awareness of, I am going to be more effective, more productive if I have these things, and they make me a better employee for you, is actually just, companies always take that seriously.
Great. So these questions are awesome, you guys. So way to go. Next question. In tech these days, there's an expectation in many roles that you must be available during a broad range of time zones to accommodate global offices and meetings. And I think that probably extends beyond tech as well, with how global and interconnected our working world is these days. How do you recommend addressing that up front?
Oh, that's also great. Really great questions, Yuhal. I love this. I do think that is a bit of a modern reality, is having with companies that are global, multinational companies, the idea that you might have to work across time zones and work sort of hours that bleed out of normal schedules is the unfortunate reality. So literally, I have to just share this anecdote. We just hired our director of engineering today, which we're so excited. The company he's coming from, he had to take 3 a.m. phone calls the last 3 days because they work across different time zones, which I think is insane. Like I don't even know how anybody can make any sense at 3 a.m. So I would, in terms of this sort of longer 24-hour work cycle, there has to be a trade-off. If this is the reality of that company, first of all, I would hope you know that going into it and kind of go into things with eyes open. If you do know that, I think this is one of those, like, it's a give-get type of thing, where if the expectation is that you might have to be available off hours, that means you have to have greater flexibility during your quote unquote daytime working hours. And so my recommendation on that would be is that, you find a way to manage getting yourself back some downtime. And if it happens to be workday, middle of the day sort of workday downtime, maybe that's not ideal in terms of the schedule, but it's something that you get back to sort of manage the peaks and valleys. The other recommendation I have is, things don't always require that like 2-second response time. And the thing I would encourage you to do is, with the company, better communicate, like, when is the expectation that you are available like 24/7, or that you have like 10-minute response time at 3 a.m. And if there are times of peaks and there are times where there's like something very urgent that is happening, that's fine. I don't think that's appropriate for that to keep going on an ongoing basis. And there has to be a way to manage that. And the communication of this is a really urgent sort of critical product development time versus this is not. But I do think it's a give-get, which is, if you're giving them that flexibility, quote unquote, where you are available at these off hours, then you have to get something back. And this is where we talk about where like flexibility attacks. Flexibility shouldn't mean working 24/7. It should mean still doing your job, but then you get some alternate flexibility back in exchange.
Great, thank you. Next question, given how few women CEOs they are in that Fortune 500 list that you mentioned, I think there's an even bigger spotlight on the women CEOs of today's world. So this listener is asking specifically about Elizabeth Holmes, who was the biotech startup head, yes, whose company ended up a sham. Then we have, other examples like Marissa Myers and Sheryl Sandberg that all are bringing kind of a different personality and a different style to their leadership roles. Who do you think is a strong representative or role model of a woman in a leadership position that folks should really look to as an example?
Oh, and I'm so biased about this because she's also our advisor. So this one is an easy one. I look to Anne Marie Slaughter. She was a major inspiration. Her article that was in the Atlantic years ago, I think it was in 2013, Why Women Can't Have It All. Maybe it was a few years before that, actually. And then her recent book, Unfinished Business, and then she has a new one coming out. I think she is the most humane and inspiring leader I have ever encountered. We actually recruited her to be an advisor on a cold email, which was just an incredible experience, getting to meet her and talk to her. what I personally find inspiring is that she never denies being a parent, and being a parent is ever present in her life. And she's very clear about her boundaries. Like her whole thing was, when her kids were young, and she worked for Secretary Clinton most recently, and now she's the CEO at New America Foundation. It's a think tank. She actually talks about the fact that when her kids were younger, she really gunned it, and her husband was much more the primary parent. And when her son was in high school, he started getting into some things that really could have messed up his life. And that's when she realized she needed to calibrate more to home. And so everybody needs flexibility for different reasons at different times. It may be about child rearing. It may be about, unfortunately, caring for ailing parents. It may be for something else entirely. What I really love about her as a leader is she's very self-aware, and she lives and breathes this mantra, but is an incredibly ambitious, just like likable person. And so for me, I whoever asked that question, it's a great question, because I think one of the hardest things as a female CEO right now, and watching the other female CEOs that have come before me, is you're like under a microscope. I mean, men do terrible things all the time as CEOs, and the article is sort of a flash in the pan, and yet everything that has happened with Theranos, everything that has happened with Thinx and other startups, it's just this huge deal. My personal philosophy, for what it's worth, and we actually have a leadership consultant that's working with our organization right now, even though we're a tiny startup, culture obviously has been important to us from day one, because how ironic would it be if we started a company about culture and flexibility and then had a terrible culture internally? And my personal philosophy is I treat my company like they're my child, but in a wonderful way. I'm a caring parent that does intervene when I need to intervene, and is tough when I need to be tough, but I care deeply about every single person that is on my team, and I want them to rise to their greatest potential, and I want them all to be happy. And it was interesting that this leadership consultant came in and talked about the fact that there's so few companies that have sustainable high performance, and it all comes back to leadership and team. And the best leaders are actually like parents of the organization. And I find that in Anne-Marie Slaughter, and I really hope I myself can emulate that.
Awesome. Thank you. So dialing back a bit to a telecommuting schedule, how do you coach people on approaching the trust factor or barrier in requesting a more flexible schedule or working from home? I would imagine, obviously, that's the toughest when you're starting a new job before you've been able to prove yourself. But there does have to be that trust established that you're going to get your work done. So how would you approach that?
That's a wonderful question. And I completely agree with the premise that today flexibility only works with trust. And actually, by the way, strategically, the way we designed our companies, you actually have to have 6 years of work experience to join our platform, because we found that companies today are, generally speaking, not yet willing to offer this to a 22-year-old. We don't believe that's right. It's just a fact of the world. So specifically with working remote, telecommuting, whatever you want to call it, my number one tip is communication. I think that if you don't have the trust right away, you will build the trust by over communicating. And so unfortunately, in some ways, the burden is on the employee today to sort of communicate up and communicate out. The best ways I found to do that, and we actually have a couple of remote workers, is literally daily emails on priorities and accomplishments. Yes, it's super annoying, but it is incredibly effective, and people are just so impressed with seeing how much is accomplished on a day-to-day basis. Anything you can do in terms of communication and transparency, calendar transparency, working on shared servers like a Google Drive so people can see the work. I think it's about sort of making what's happening more visible is the biggest key. The other thing I would suggest is, and like I said, we do have a couple of employees. The thing that we found to be most effective is that if there is an in-person here and there, certainly like doing maybe the first week or the first couple of days of the job, spending them in the office if the company does have an office. Some are fully distributed today, but to the extent there is a office or headquarters, spending a few days on site so that people get to know you, like you, build the relationship, and like you can also absorb the culture. And then coming back for like, if there's, I see this a lot with remote sales reps. There's like an annual sales summit or a quarterly sales summit. To the extent like you can still show your face and kind of embed with a company, even if it's quarterly or a couple times a year, I think that is important. But to me, it's communication. And to the extent you can make your work product and accomplishments more transparent, the better.
And yeah, I think those are great points. And I think that extends for any employee, whether they're showing their face in the office every day or they're working remotely, is, that the way to prove your worth is to show what you're working on and what you're accomplishing. So funny question, and we do have a quick, easy answer for this. This person says, I'm going to be that person. Is there a promo code for Werk to get onto the platform? And you and I did set up a promo code for Brandeis alumni.
Yes.
So there's a promo code to get you 25% off the annual membership fee, and that is Brandeis alum. So making it easy.
It's not cap sensitive. You just go to Saywerk, it's SAYWERK.com, and you do sign up, and then just enter Brandeis alum before you click pay. Don't click pay first. Otherwise, email me, Anna@saywerk.com, and we'll fix it for you. But there is a promo code for 25% off a membership.
Awesome. Couple more questions here. And if this is something that you have seen through your research, are women culturally looking for a male CEO, and does that hinder the movement that you're a part of? Interesting question. I'm not sure that you've seen anything that talks about that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have great information to answer that. What I have seen, and it doesn't quite answer your question, but it's interesting, is in studies done around leadership, and I think you heard my background, I'm an econ psych major undergrad, so everything in my life somehow has come back to that. But in studies around leadership and qualities of leadership that people respect the most, the qualities that are most admired tend to be more female attributes. So you actually have to do with empathy, with prioritization. Women are actually better at prioritizing than men are. Women are more empathic than men are, and so it's interesting on sort of studies of like qualities most admired at leadership. Some of the more female associated qualities rank higher than some of the male associated qualities. I have not seen anything to show that men or women prefer to work with men or women. Like I just actually have not seen it skew one way or another. I think one of the challenges is that our dominant understanding of a CEO is that it's a man. And it's interesting being a parent and seeing that in my child. And I try very hard to like correct him. And I remember even like we were getting on a plane and he's like, where's that pilot guy? And I'm like, it could be a girl. We don't know. Like she might be the best person for the job. But these things start very young. And I think, one of the things that's hard to disaggregate is we do have a lot of preconceived notions about what leadership might look like, even though when asked what we want, we might actually want more female qualities. So I'm not sure that quite answers your question, but I don't know off the top of my head any research that would support that otherwise.
Yeah, no, I think those are fair points, looking at the qualities and just our preconceived notions of leadership. So were there any experiences that you had at Brandeis, either in the classroom or extracurricularly, that you felt prepared you especially well to tackle the issues of gender gap in leadership and the critical need for flexibility in the workplace? I love this question. I feel like it's a staff plant, but I don't think it is.
Yeah,
it's great.
I like that, man. It's just such a good question. What is interesting is at Brandeis, I never observed any issues with like gender challenges. Like I observed that a lot at HBS, but not at Brandeis. Like that was not honestly anywhere on my radar. And as I said, I like kind of went into my first job, not questioning remotely that women and men were completely equal and could achieve completely equal things. There were I would say a lot of my inspiration for what I've done, like a lot of things did start at Brandeis. So number one, I would say what I loved about Brandeis was because it was like such a small, scrappy school in a wonderful way, I felt like I could shape my own program. And I think that made me feel like nothing is set in stone and everything is changeable. So the fact that I was able to do a double major in like 3.5 years, like study abroad in that time frame and get all of that done and like, kind of do anything I wanted to do and create my own path was just incredible. And I think that sort of led me to never taking any rules too seriously and in a good way and believing that I could change the rules. The other thing, and it's interesting now that you asked this question, it like jogs my memory. I took one class that was in advertising in the media, and we had a whole like part of the lesson that was about gender bias in the media. And I'm not sure I quite remembered it until we started talking about it right now. But I still remember distinctly in one of the classes, we watched commercials featuring girls and boys side by side. And some of them were like the Gap commercials. And in every commercial, like the gender bias was so clear. The boys were always like rough and tumble. They were active, they were yelling, they were physical. And the girls were so demure to the point where they were constantly covering their mouths when they laughed. They were playing with their mommy's makeup. And it's interesting, like I always thought about how messed up that was and how that just seems ridiculous that at such an early age, we're already putting children in categories and sort of creating preconceived notions and self-fulfilling prophecies around what their life would be like. But that was just interesting that seed was planted there. But the biggest inspiration was that I felt like you can kind of create your own world and break a lot of the rules in the best possible way.
Right, absolutely. And just, you and I were just talking about being mothers of boys, and, it does start so early on. And we can we can help change it individually, honestly, but seeing it in the context of our professional work is so interesting, because you get so in tune to it now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I in an interview recently, somebody asked me if I parent my son differently, and I will now not only identify as a feminist, but potentially radicalized feminist, watching what's happening in our country and even launching this startup. But I say I raise him exactly like I would raise a girl, and that actually is the innovation. And it's been interesting to me how gendered toys are. I mean, there's been so many articles about when Target merged the aisles, and they had a girls aisle and a boys aisle, and somehow all the Legos were in the boys aisle, which is completely unfair. I was the girl that always played with Legos. And it is interesting that a lot of these notions are set very early on. Topic for another conversation, but I do think a lot of our conceptions of like leadership and our expectations start at a very, very young age.
Right. Other question here, I more focused on gender bias specifically, and perceptions of women as being aggressive versus assertive, which are two very similar words that mean very different things. So in some more macho cultures, this listener asks, if a hard answer comes from a male, it's seen as appropriate and proper. However, being seen that way by a woman, she seems unstable. How do you recommend managing these differences? So again, I think the perception of women in the workforce as being that aggressive versus assertive. Do you have any tips for that?
Oh, such a good question. So number one, I think the challenge is that we cannot change gender bias overnight, and I think there is just so much entrenched here, and there's so much unconscious bias. There's actually a couple of startups that are doing, it's not quite your question, but what they're doing is they're addressing gender bias in how we read people's resumes and performance reviews. Their software actually scans them and takes out any gendered words, right? Because we already start developing bias, even like reviewing resumes, like women are just perceived differently. To the question of communication, number one, I just like never, ever back down from if you have a better answer or the right answer. I think the fear that a lot of us women, including myself, have had in the past, you actually are doing disservice to your organization by not sharing that. There's been actually, unfortunately, research to show that the reason men react negatively to when women speak up assertively is actually, it actually has to do with stimulus response. And we tend to respond more significantly to a stimulus we experience more rarely. So bear with me for a second. If you feel something all the time, you're not going to react to it. If you feel something sharp, all of a sudden, you're going to react to it. And it's the same with women's voices. Women's voices actually communicate at a different pitch than men's voices, because there tend to be fewer women in a room. Men actually experience a different visceral response to a woman's voice than a man's voice, which is ridiculous, right? But that is not something we can change overnight. And so I think the answer to that is to keep speaking up. And I think the other advice in the near term, because there are sometimes frankly penalties for that, is what happened in the previous White House administration, where women developed other women allies that amplified what they're saying. And I don't know if anybody's read that article, but essentially what these women did that felt like they could not get a fair shake in meetings and people were not hearing them, is they had a female counterpart that essentially would amplify them. Instead of getting mansplained after you say something, there would be a female peer that would pipe up and say, that is a wonderful idea. We've been thinking about that as well, et cetera. Also, to the extent that you can have male allies that you can be honest with about some of your concerns in terms of how assertiveness it may be perceived as aggressiveness, and they can help amplify you as well. That's always very helpful. But the reality is this is not going to change until we change the stimulus response, which means we just need more women speaking up until the response to that is the same as men speaking up.
Right. I think your points are so well taken, particularly as it relates to women serving as an example for other women. And even if, you might be in a position of power or leadership and I'm not, you could use that to help me out. And so really, I loved your idea of, women helping other women amplify their voices and, strength in numbers and strength in repetition, I think is so key. So in the last couple minutes remaining, I would love for you to just sum up any last points for our group today. Wonderful, wonderful questions. I feel like we could talk about this all day, and Anna does talk about this all day. But last thoughts before we go into just some reminders for folks.
So I think we've covered so much today. I just, first of all, want to thank you all for joining. Everybody has crazy, busy lives. So thank you for sharing an hour of your day with me. It just means everything. And your questions were just so engaged and involved and really hard. And I love that. My final thoughts are, I think there's been a constant theme, and I mentioned this in one of the slides. Gender bias should never be a disincentive for action. There's so much today that comes from, frankly, centuries and since the dawn of time, women being treated differently from men. And that should not be ever holds us back from acting on these things and trying to change them. I think we need to continue to set great examples for women that are our peers and women that are coming in after us. And the more we sort of fight for the equality and try to address some of the root causes instead of band-aid solutions, the more likely we are to change things. The reality is, like, women are respected as leaders. The more companies are gender diverse, the better they perform, the more people are happier there, the more they, I mentioned they outperform in every single metric and attribute. And so this is just clearly important. There is no structural reason why women should not have equal participation, equal voice, equal aspirations. And so the thing I would encourage us all, and sometimes it is discouraging, which is that the gender bias is still out there. I think we need to continue to work through it and plow through it, frankly, and just continue to have strength in numbers.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and suggestions and advice, and just bringing attention to this very important topic. And I wish you the best of luck with work, and look forward to having you stay connected. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you all again.
So Anna, if you could just advance to the next slide for me. Couple next steps for everyone. If you could please fill out our satisfaction survey to let us know how we did today. We have at least one webinar every month for alumni free of charge, and all of these topics are based on what you want to learn about. So our next one coming up in just 2 short weeks is about how to hit the ground running in a new job and really make an impact in those first 100 days. So that's really great for young professionals, but certainly things that everyone could benefit from. We talked about the power of the Brandeis alumni network in information gathering and doing informational interviews to do that homework piece of learning more about a company. So LinkedIn is a great place to do that and to find one another. So the Hyatt Career Center does manage the Brandeis University Career Connections group, and the link is here on your screen. Additionally, we do offer free career services for life through the Hyatt Career Center to all undergraduate students and alumni. So that includes one-on-one career appointments for resume reviews, LinkedIn profile reviews, job search strategy, negotiation strategy as well. And then lastly, I just want to leave you with my contact information and the contact information for the Hyatt Career Center if you need to get in touch with us. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope to see you at our next webinar.